Our panel today have sort of thought through what they want to say and how they want to say it, all of them involved with the Stakeholder Forum. The Stakeholder Forum's job is to connect people who are impacted by international conferences with those conferences, to be a kind of broker. And Felix Dodds, who is our first speaker, is the executive director with a long history of blogging and activities in the international realm. Felix, thank you very much for being here. Felix is going to talk a little bit about the history of Rio and what he thinks some of the prospects of Rio may be. And he will be followed by Kirsty Schneeberger. Is that right?
Correct.
Drilled it?
Yes.
Good. So Kirsty's going to talk about the green economy, as is Rio+20. All right. Rina is a student at Harvard, and they have just been through this very successful green economy event, long-term picture, and Rita's going to share that and other items with us. Felix, it's over to you, and we'll just whip it right along here. How's that?
I'm going to go over three things: how we got to Rio+20, a little bit about what Rio+20 will be achieving, and then I'll hand over to Kirsty, who will deal with part of the conversation on the green economy, and then what happens on Monday. It's always important to know what happens after a conference, as well as what happens at the conference. So how did we get there? So just to recap, and I'm sure many of you know about this, but I just wanted to put this into perspective. Of course, Rio itself in 1992 was an enormously significant event. We had the 40 chapters of Agenda 21, which covered many aspects, anything from oceans to reform of the UN, to poverty, to forests, to biodiversity. We had a Rio Declaration, 27 principles on how we should, in a sense, guide our activities on this planet. Issues like the polluter pays principle, prior informed consent, common and differentiated responsibility. There was meant to be a third convention at Rio, in addition to the ones on climate and biodiversity, one on forests. It wasn't possible to negotiate. Part of the issue was, in a sense, the national ownership of forests, and in a sense, the responsibility of those countries to manage those forests. Those countries felt there should be some financial reward to enable them to do that. There was the setting up of a new UN institution to deal with the follow-up to the Rio conference, the Commission on Sustainable Development, a functioning commission of the United Nations Economic and Social Council. But one of the big outcomes was this, these 9 chapters of Agenda 21 that dealt with the roles and responsibilities for different stakeholders. No longer were NGOs just this amorphous group, but the recognition that 9 specific sectors, and maybe there should have been more, have a particular role and responsibility in a sense, implementing the agreements and being part of the conversation. So business was some, trade unions was another, indigenous peoples, women, traditional NGOs, youth, the next generation. Those 9 were the first time that the UN had a document that identified roles and responsibilities. And what we had was this Chapter 28, which the Tea Party loved, which deals with local Agenda 21, where, as you've seen, there's been a campaign in this country to stop the promotion of Agenda 21 at the local level. But in fact, if you read Chapter 28, it's all about what should local communities do by getting their population together, their business community, their other stakeholders, to envision what kind of society they want to have in that city or in that town. And by 2002, over 6,000 local Agenda 21s have been created worldwide. And so, though it hadn't been such of a movement in the US under that term, globally it was quite important. And we had over 100 national councils on sustainable development. You had the President Clinton's National Council, didn't survive his term in office, but it might be something that President Obama could announce if he comes to Rio as something he would like to set up, kind of looking at advising national government on how to move forward, involving all stakeholders in that. But that wasn't the only set of agreements that came out of Rio. I mean, those are huge. There was also another convention on desertification There was one dealing with straddling fish stocks. Prior informed consent, which came much later, is in the chemicals and hazardous waste chapters of Agenda 21, persistent organic pollutants. So it was actually a conference that agreed a significant amount of international regulation or set those in motion. But the deal in Rio was, of course, that funding to enable developing countries to move to a more sustainable form of development would be helped, that we would ensure that China didn't go through the same type of development model that, in fact, we've had. And in 1992, Maurice Strong was asked how much would that cost? And he was told it would be $625 billion a year with aid transfer of $125 billion between North and South. And what we found in 92 was that we were giving around 60 billion in aid. It fell, it didn't go up in the 1990s, and only got back up to the level of 1992 by 2002. Of course, it's increased since then. But that had a significant impact, a missed opportunity of moving the development patterns of developing countries into a more sustainable one. There was an attempt for the conference in Johannesburg in 2002 to try and create a new financial deal. They had two other major conferences happening around that, Monterey, Financing for Development, and the Doha Development Round. And that the package of Johannesburg in 2002 was meant to perhaps put us back on a trajectory to move to a more sustainable planet. But as we all know, 9/11 happened, and the opportunities to, in a sense, have a conversation about sustainable development reduced very effectively to virtually little by the 2002 summit. We did see one success from the Johannesburg summit in 2002 being that Canada and Russia agreed to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And I think it's highly unlikely that if that conference hadn't happened, that they would have agreed to that. Of course, those were not the levels of carbon dioxide emissions that we needed, but they were the ones that were on the table. There was very little progression between 2002 and 2006 on the implementation of the financial deal in Monterey and the Doha Development Round. And the president of South Africa announced in 2006 that Johannesburg was dead. It was a forgotten piece of paper. We saw a failure of an agreement on energy in 2007 at the Commission on Sustainable Development. And then the Brazilian president announced in September 2007 that we needed a new summit, a new sustainable development summit to bring together the family and refocus our efforts to try and ensure that we can actually move on that sustainable platform. And it's important that things are happening locally, but we also need to recognize we live on one small planet and the need to link and help and support those communities globally that need to move in the right direction. As we know, Copenhagen did not deliver what was hoped, and we also had a failure in 2011 on sustainable consumption and production at the global level. So what will Rio achieve? Well, it has a number of objectives: to review previous commitments, to look at the new and emerging issues, and that's around a lot of the environmental security agenda, food security, water security, energy security. We needed a new, renewed political will, because sustainable development was to some extent dead by the end of the last decade. The themes of the conference were to focus on institutional reform at all levels, on sustainable development, and the green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty alleviation. One of the very interesting discourses that's come to a forefront in the run-up to Rio+20 has been the planetary boundaries work of Joachim Rockström. And so what you have here is what's known as the Oxfam donut. And so in response to the limits, the 9 limits that Joachim Rockström has identified, Oxfam put on the table a social foundation that we need to have in our societies, which would include food, water, income, education, some of the rights agenda. And that in fact, the difference between the social foundation the planetary boundaries is the operating space that we have to do it. And if you haven't watched it, there's a very good Oxfam video dealing with the donut, and I recommend it. So there was the beginning of a renewed political will with the Nagoya Agreement on Biodiversity in 2010. Cancun was an advancement on where we'd ended up in 2009 in Copenhagen. And I think it was Michelle who talked about relationships in the previous presentation downstairs. Relationships make a huge difference. Trust, building trust in a global family to move forward is the only way you're going to get advancements at the global level. And the idea that 130 heads of state will be coming to Rio, the largest number that has been to a conference ever, has an opportunity for us to hope that they will go away a little bit more educated about what sustainable development is and what we can do to ensure that when they get back to their capitals, that they take up the challenges that they need to for the future. There'll be over 50,000 stakeholders attending the conference. The largest number of business people attending, for good or bad, they will be there, many of them from the good side of the business community. There'll be huge media interest, but it's the beginning of a global narrative similar to what happened in the 1990s, where the UN had a series of conferences on key issues. And if we're able to globally look at those as a whole, then the chances are that we can come out of it with a better plan of how to address the next 5 and 10 years. Perhaps one of the biggest outcomes from Rio, and we've not even, in many cases, arrived in Rio yet, because many people will be leaving in the next few days. Already, Rio is a success, no matter what anything else happens from now on, because what's happened over the last year is the development of the concept of Sustainable Development Goals. Many of you will have heard of Millennium Development Goals, which dealt with the development paradigm, poverty, education, health issues. That process has gone parallel to the Sustainable Development discourse. And what's happened due to the leadership of Colombia, Peru, Guatemala from the south is that they've already changed the whole conversation for the post-2015 debate on what type of goals we should have. They should be universal and they should be sustainable. So no matter what else happens in Rio, it's already had a huge success. Some of these are the kinds of goal areas that people are discussing. And if you look at the text that you have being negotiated, and people talk about 70 paragraphs being negotiated and another 250 yet to go. In there are some really important nuggets. Targets on water, targets on energy, targets on oceans and seas, and targets on food security. If those pass through, they will become part of what becomes the next set of commitments that fit into the post-2015 discourse. I'm going to finally look at the governance area, and then I'm going to pass over to Kirsty. So governance can be seen as a little boring for people, but actually has a huge impact. We have very weak international governance institutions. We have a very weak one on sustainable development, the Commission on Sustainable Development. We have a very weak environment one called the UN Environment Programme. Both of those will be much stronger institutions after Rio. We already know that. We don't know how strong, much stronger, but both of them will have more powers and will be able to do more things. There's a recognition that on the science base, the scientists have now globally come together under a thing called Future Earth, which I think is a wonderful platform, led by Joachim Rockström from the Stockholm Resilience Institute. It's brought together ICSU and some of the other platforms of global scientists into one framework. What we need is an equivalent in the UN system. So we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We have the one on biodiversity. We're in danger of fragmenting science. And what we need is an overarching panel on sustainable development. That's on the agenda, as is a chief scientist for the Secretary General. But it's not just at the global level we need activity. We need it at the state level, and at the local level as well. And so the opportunity of this conference is to be part of the engine for taking the green economy ideas that you've got and sharing them through things like the New Economic Institute's map, which is part of the program we've been working on, but which is an excellent opportunity to share wherever you are in the world the ideas that are working and that can be replicated. There is a talk of a global convention on Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration: access to information, public participation, and environmental justice. It's something which in Europe we call the Aarhus Convention. And I don't know if many of you know this, but you're all part of Europe in America, because in the UN terms, you're part of the Economic Commission for Europe, which includes America and Canada. So we outvote you there in any of the kind of discussions. So Americans don't tend to like that commission. But what else will come out of Rio? There'll be dialogue days of stakeholders looking at many of the issues like energy and forests being fed into the heads of state discussions. There'll be a people's forum, which will be, similar to what you're having here, with lots of ideas and new thoughts. I went to the 1992 conference. And is anyone here from Sustainable Seattle? Well, I stole a lot of their ideas and took them back to England, repackaged them, and we did sustainability indicators, because I went to a tent in Rio and learned about what Sustainable Seattle was doing. So there'll be a lot of cross-fertilization. There's going to be industry days looking at how industry can be much more pro-sustainable development. Local government has its conference. State government has its conference. There is a personal pledge campaign linked to what you can personally do, but that personal campaign will carry on for the next 4 years. And the hope is that it will get to hundreds of millions of people by 2015, which can start to indicate what impact personal pledges can have. There's a commitments register, which gives you an indication of what, for example, the town of, or the city of New York might make to do over the next 3 years, or what a particular company would do, or what a particular NGO. There's 560 side events in the main forum, ignoring outside that, and 50,000 people to be inspired and to go back and to change their communities. I'm going to hand over to Kirsty.
So before I go into the substance of the text that's being negotiated in Rio, I just thought I might preface that by thinking about this conference, the people in this room, the people in this conference, and what I've been hearing for the last day and a half, and why this is relevant. And I've heard the UN mentioned a couple of times in the sessions, in the plenary sessions, sometimes with a bit of a question mark after its efficacy, after how successful Rio or other conferences often are. And I think one of the most important things that's going to come out of Rio, aside from the text, and Felix was touching on it here by talking about the stakeholder engagement and the dialogue days, is that groups like the New Economics Institute are able to bring into Rio, to put under the noses of the bureaucrats and the negotiators and the ministers and the heads of state who are going to be there, some of the most amazing examples of how this policy stuff, the global governance stuff, the green economy stuff, is actually being put into practice on the ground. And I think that's a really important message to be taking into Rio. It's not just a conference that's going to be agreeing this global international sustainable development architecture. It's also an opportunity, I would say, to show that alternative ways are possible. Sustainable development is happening on the ground as much as it is going to be negotiated in the text. One of the projects that Stakeholder Forum does with the New Economics Foundation and the New Economics Institute is the Global Transition 2012. So you can see there that the ultimate vision is an alternative global green economy that maximizes well-being, operates within environmental limits, and that's going back to the PowerPoint slide Felix brought up about the donut, operating within environmental limits, and is capable of coping and adapting to global environmental change. So we, over the last year, in order to feed into the Rio+20 process, have been working with NEF and the New Economics Institute, as well as the Green Economy Coalition, to to develop some policy recommendations. We are policy wonks, I do have to say, to develop some policy recommendations based on some really big ideas. And one of the things that we did at the beginning of the Global Transition Programme last year was to commission some challenge papers. The likes of Andy Sims, you probably went to one of his workshops either earlier today or yesterday afternoon, writing on the green economy, some really big, challenging ideas about how we can shift to a new economic paradigm, how we can shift to a global green economy. And taking those challenge papers and drawing out some of the key policy ideas that could be taken to Rio and inputted into the process. And that's really what Stakeholder Forum does. We take some of the big ideas and try and put them into the process. And that's been through having one-on-one meetings with governments, capacity building workshops, just trying to spread the ideas as much as we can. But we also had some interactive dialogues, not too dissimilar to this weekend, some 1- and 2-day dialogues where these big ideas, the policy recommendations were discussed as part of the programme, and then how can they be taken into the process. Over the last 6 months, we've been in New York working with the UN to try and feed that into the process. We're going to be having some events in Rio with the New Economics Institute. Please do write your messages on the board. I think Bob yesterday, and again, maybe there was a reminder today, you can write some messages on the board should you wish. And then turning policy into actions. So I mentioned the challenge papers, just put up there a couple of them, looking at the blue economy. In fact, one of the workshops tomorrow morning, a NEF person, Rupert Crilly, wrote a big paper for us on the blue economy. Beyond GDP, different metrics of measuring social progress. We heard about the Maryland, governor of Maryland, who is already implementing the GPI. Jobs, employment and skills, looking at energy and energy resources, global finance and banking, food security and global trade. We have a couple of other papers coming out, so if you are interested, we have actually here just a few more left, some booklets on all of this stuff that I've been talking about. So that's the project that we've been working on for the last year, feeding into Rio. And we go to Rio on Monday, and it's the culmination of a lot of this work. But as I'll come to at the end, it's not the end. In fact, it's just the beginning. So green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. Some of the key outcomes that are going to be agreed in Rio include things like principles. If we are going to be transitioning to a green economy, what are the fundamental non-negotiable principles that need to underpin that new paradigm, that new economic paradigm that we're talking about? Knowledge sharing. The UN is really interested, and I think it was Michelle earlier talking about connecting the ideas. If you are thinking about shifting to a new paradigm and illuminating the new, you need to be sharing knowledge, you need to be connecting, joining up those dots of all of the different projects that are happening on the ground. And that's largely what the New Economics Institute and the Global Transition Map is doing. Capacity building. How can we be using this knowledge? How can we be transferring the knowledge? It's not just about transferring technology and patented technology. It's actually about sharing knowledge and building the capacity of others to upscale and replicate green economy initiatives. Enabling environments. What are the legal frameworks that need to be put in place at the national level to enable this flourishing of initiatives on the ground? And they're just developing and implementing new measures of economic success. So that's going to be agreed in Rio, and I think that's pretty cool. I think that's really good that the UN and the member states are having a conversation about the importance of knowledge sharing and capacity building so that grassroots activities can flourish on the ground. This slide is a bit dense, but I just wanted to put it up there. You're not going to be able to read them all, but it's online. I think these PowerPoint slides are going to be shared. So some of the key principles for the green economy. Over the last 40 years, there is a really rich body of international agreements in this area. And some of the work that we've been doing with NEF is to try and draw out some of the core non-negotiable principles, such as intergenerational equity, information, participation, and accountability, looking at what are the principles underlining sustainable consumption and production, and so on. that's a whistle-stop tour of the policy wonkery of the green economy in Rio. We'll be around for the rest of the day and tomorrow if you'd like to speak a bit more policy techie stuff. But now, what happens on Monday? Pick a Monday, any Monday. We're going to have a summit. We're going to have a conference in Rio. But then what? And a colleague of ours often says, we've worked out the what, we've worked out the so what, now we need to get into the what next. And I think that's the idea behind, firstly, a conference that we're going to be running with multi-stakeholders, member states included. It's to try and drive at, well, what's going to happen next? We're going to have a piece of paper, great, but how are we going to be turning that talk into walk? So we're working with a number of the UN agencies as well as other stakeholders to help them develop their implementation strategies. So this is a conference about strategies for the new economy. We're going to be working with stakeholders to help them work out what their implementation strategies are going to be. And we're going to focus on 4 key areas. We can't do everything. We'd love to, but we do need to get some sleep. Oceans, cities, jobs, and fresh water. And as Felix already pointed out, 2012 to 15 is really a critical time for global governance. So it's actually going to be a program of work, working with the UN as well as other stakeholders to work their implementation plans out for 2012 to 2015 and beyond, and the post-Millennium Development Goal agenda. And I just thought I'd finish with one of my favorite symbols of this. It's an hourglass. So we've taken the big picture, the big thinking, challenge papers, great ideas, the stuff that comes out of meetings and conferences like this. You narrow it down into particular stories, examples of success, policy recommendations. You distill out the key ideas. You work out the granularity as you're going down. And then after Rio, what we're going to be doing is widening out to the bottom bit of the hourglass. Great, we've got the stories of success. Now how do we all go and help these grassroots activities flourish? 1,000 flowers are going to bloom and they are all going to survive. And so that's extrapolating to strategies for implementation on a global scale. And with that, thank you very much.
So T.S. Eliot writes in one of my favorite poems, The Wasteland, we think of the key, each in his prison. Thinking of the key, each confirms a prison. Well, I really think this relates to Rio and another thing I'm going to talk about, which is sort of the youth movement around the new economy, is that we really need to stop imagining this socially, historically constructed prison around us, which is really only the product of our imaginations, and start imagining the physical reality that binds us in this world. And I think this is somehow opposite to what has been happening in recent times, with like Francis Fukuyama talking about the end of history, our social constructions being closed into the economic model that right now exists. And then on the other hand, the physical world being this sort of fluid, technologically alterable, infinite creation. And I think that's, we need to sort of reverse that and really, we've really hit the wall, and we can see that in our ecological world, in the end of the agricultural revolution, climate change, and to see that the social world is transformable, and that we must transition because the planet ultimately will not change and its limits are bound. And what really, I think this really comes out in Rio+20, and I think that's an achievement that we must acknowledge. Like Felix was saying, it has already been a success in some ways, and I think just to have these questions opened up on the global scale in countries where it wasn't talked about, and to actually have these discourses, no matter, we won't know what they lead to yet, but that's already wonderful. And we haven't, of course, reached the tipping point yet in terms of these questions, but I think this will be a real milestone on our journey there. So I'm a student at Harvard, and I've been I've been working on the Earth Summit with Sustain Us and with Stakeholder Forum more recently. And something that we did on these questions this spring was organize a conference called Transition to a New Economy, which was 150 people from different universities, young professionals, to look really partly at Rio+20, also different ways of organizing the economy and to really open those discussions. And that's just, you know, one drop in the ocean. And I think there's, since Occupy, there's just been a real shift and people have really started engaging with these issues. And I especially saw it in the student community. And for instance, in this room, we have Annie McShearis, who's working with responsible endowments and spoke earlier today. And there are two young ecological economists here who I know. And I think it's really important that people are actually narrating positive alternatives, because what I've noticed is that this gloomy scenario by itself serves often to sort of decapitate our imagination and our ability to imagine what is possible. And Rio+20 is I think a chance to really have some sort of inspirational platform to imagine these questions. Yeah, while being honest to realities, as Stuart said yesterday, we still have to dream and make those dreams come possible. And the UN is sort of one of the like remnants of that sort of thinking, I think, for the better and the worse. So I'll talk a bit about the green economy now, which is one of the main themes, as Felix said in the conference. And it's in the context of poverty eradication and sustainable development. And this framing really came about because many countries were worried, and especially the group of 77, the sort of poor countries, were worried that this could be a framework that would impose even more financial burdens on them, you know, sort of standards that they don't have the resources to meet, and it would just be sort of a new Washington consensus, which is what some critics have been calling Rio+20. And I think our task really is not to say, oh, you know, dismiss the conference, but to say we cannot allow it to be this way, because we cannot afford to have another Washington consensus with the crisis we're facing. And other people have been saying it could be the Tahrir Square of the green movement. And there is a People's Summit happening parallel to it, and just especially lots of Latin American society organizing around it, which is really incredible. And it's just, my Brazilian friends are saying it's like everybody's talking about Rio+20 on the streets. And it's nice to see that it's actually somehow embedded in the local context as well. And really, if people who think about ecological economics and these questions, if those people don't take the lead on it, somebody definitely will, and those people will narrate a vision of the green economy that we won't like, and I think therefore it is responsibility of us to make that alternative narrated and seen by people. And yeah, so as a concept, the context of the green economy in poverty eradication really sort of also asserts for the first time on the global scale that these, the narrative of social justice and poverty eradication needs not run opposite to environmental and sustainability questions, and then things like common but differentiated responsibility. All of these things are still open in the text and are still in brackets. So lots of things could happen in terms of social justice as well as the green movement. And I think it's really important that the conference is so heavily now engaging on the issue of the underlying context and the issues of structural inequality and injustice, like 1% of the world's population being in charge of 50% of the planet's wealth, and because unless those questions are challenged on a global scale, we'll just keep being in a position where the global economy is inequitable, and while local solutions are of course important, these discussions and these plans need to happen on a global scale as well, if that is ever to be solved at all. One of the really exciting ideas, which was mentioned also before, is beyond GDP, and sort of alternative measures of valuing different things. And Bhutan had an event on this in the UN recently, and countries like Thailand have been developing different sort of ways of valuing not just monetary and financial things through GDP, but valuing happiness, valuing just our social relations and the actual richness of our lives in whatever forms it is to be fostered. And this is also still part of the text, may not be, but that's still under discussion. And one of the issues here is that if there is to be space for developing countries to grow, the materialized economic growth of developed countries must, of course, make space for this. And there's a term "right to development," which is being used, which the EU, for instance, is in support of, and it's not, of course, just the necessity of beyond GDP, but it's the desirability as well. Because, as Tim Jackson says, people are persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't need to create impressions that don't last on people we don't care about. And that I quite like that phrasing. So one thing that the G77 has been a little bit worried about has been the sort of commodification and financialization of resources, and that's something that a lot of articles have also been written about, if you've been reading those, and sort of displacing communitarian practices and ways of creating wealth in ways that are sort of non-commodifiable in some way. And the Bolivian civil society has accused the multinational businesses for hijacking the term green and sort of narrating it in their terms, but of course we must then hijack the term back and make it something different if that is the case. And I think, again, what was mentioned in the earlier talk was ownership, and I think that is, again, crucial, and who has the rights to nature if it is to be valued, and who actually owns these things. And that is something that needs to be tackled with if the G77 is to accept a lot of the things in the text, because if they feel like the money will just go somewhere else once their resources are valued, they won't adhere to it. And then I guess another interesting thing that is especially pertinent in the context of the US is the issue of fossil fuel subsidies and pricing of externalities. So Bill McKibben sort of gave Rio a little bit of a rant yesterday, but I actually think he would agree with some of the stuff that is still under negotiation in the text, which is that there is still a proposal to phase out environmentally harmful fossil fuel and energy subsidies, and the phrasing of this is under negotiation. But there is still, there's even a phrase that sort of in account to protecting the poor and easing the transition for those affected communities of phasing out of fossil fuels. So there is still material there, and another aspect of this is, of course, that prices in general don't really reflect the reality at the moment, and this is something that the text also tries to tackle with, is that we price a ketchup bottle according to its relation to other products, not according to its relation to reality and its production process and what its actual position is in the world, and there is that bridge that needs to be made with sustainable consumption and production, and that is another theme that is in the text. And here also, the developing countries have called for richer countries to take a lead on this and to develop sustainable lifestyle programs and different initiatives in order to because they have better resources, and they have historically had much more ability to produce things, and in this sense it's historically just perhaps for this to happen. And another part of this is, of course, corporate social responsibility and accountability, which is yet another theme under the green economy. And And for this, there's all kinds of solutions on the table: voluntary market, regulatory, and it includes just the international redistribution of wealth, like to enable like greener infrastructure to emerge in poor countries, because it won't really happen until we address the problem of the overarching sort of architecture of what corporations are doing, and markets can also be employed for many good purposes, and the form of that the market is taking at the moment is, of course, again, socially fluid and historically changeable. So again, I mentioned the standards and labels problem, sort of that the G77 has been having, and that also relates to this, because if we have sustainable production, for instance, there may be labels that hinder the ability of countries that have less resources to trade certain products, and this burden should not fall on the poorest countries, but instead there should be some sort of mechanisms of redistribution that would allow if...
Now I'm going to take the chairman's prerogative and say I think that's it for now. Let me ask all three of you a difficult question. Right? If we're talking about, the UN has two missions. One is a blue helmet mission, and the other is an economic development mission. Essentially, those are the two things that the UN is chartered to do. How can you do economic development without reference to energy? You mentioned energy only in terms of removal of subsidies, but there's nowhere in this whole discussion or document any discussion at all, mentioned once in your, no discussion at all of energy. Why is that, and how can you possibly expect a successful outcome for a mission on sustainable development without discussion of energy? And what about what we would term the elephant in the room? The population of the world is going from 7 to 9 to 10 billion people with dramatically increased consumption, and what's the relationship of that to a discussion of sustainable development?
I mean, there is a big section on energy in the text. We didn't cover it in the context of the presentation, but it is clearly one of the key issues that is in section 5 of the text. It has, as you know, the Secretary General set up his own panel on access to energy. It will be reporting to Rio and will have some impact on the finalization of that particular part of the text. So I think that that's a reason why it's left open. On the population, we have the population conference happening virtually, I think, 1 year later in 2013. So to some extent, the population conversation is happening after we've dealt with that. But of course, the issue should be focused much more on stronger sustainable consumption and production issues than it is, because it's not the increase in population that's going to have the impact, it's the increase in consumption that we need to deal with. And that's why the Rio Accord would, if it had been implemented, ensured a much better trajectory for China and other countries to a more sustainable form of economy. And so I think we missed an opportunity in the 90s to move in the right direction. There's not been any significant global agreement on sustainable consumption and production since Rio. I mean, all of the times that the UN has attempted to do some type of plan, it hasn't happened. So I think our responsibility, as Rina was talking about, is to approach it by showing what have we done in 20 years about changing our consumption patterns into a more sustainable one, because there is enough to share around in the world if we actually want to see a fair and equitable planet.
Time for other thoughts and questions? Okay, next group's trying to come in, so thank you all very much.